What's very difficult is to concentrate in a single image a whole personality. That's the problem of the portrait artist.
Les Grandes Dames de l'Art is a series of podcasts produced by Aware, archives of women artists, research and exhibitions, in partnership with the INA, with the support of Maison Veuve Clicquot and the Ministry of Culture. Great women of art. Les Grandes Dames de l'Art. The great women of art.
Les Grandes Dames de l'Art.
The podcast Les Grandes Dames de l'Art, Great Women of Art, gives voice to the women artists of the 20th century. They talk about their work, their lives, the world around them, and their conquests. Let's search for their presence and their secrets. Let's find the hidden stories of women artists whilst listening to their voices. Amongst the many women artists that need to be rediscovered, Gisèle Freund has, without a doubt, the most interesting life. It is difficult to add to what she said herself, so clear and articulate, so intelligent and witty about her double life as a photographer and a photography historian. She was born in 1908 to a bourgeois German Jewish family. She was 12 when her father gave her her first camera, but she became a photographer by necessity. She had to put herself through university, where she studied sociology and history of art, first in Freiburg, then in Frankfurt, in order to become a journalist. She started a PhD on the history of photography that she continued in Paris, making it her city of refuge from 1933. As a member of the Socialist Youth, she was afraid of persecution. In the 1930s, the history of photography was still nascent. Gisèle Freund was part of its construction, as was Walter Benjamin, whom she met in Paris at the National Library. At the time, he was doing research for his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Published in 1936, and better known than Gisèle Freund's books, even though they share the same observations. Gisèle Freund is interviewed on the radio in 1968 at the age of 60, on the occasion of her first big exhibition in France, called Au Pays des Visages, in the Land of Faces, at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris.
I became a photographer out of necessity. I came to France in the 1930s. I studied sociology at the Sorbonne, but I didn't have the means to continue my studies. And already as a child, I was enthused about photography. Like everyone, I would take pictures. And one of my friends asked me, why don't you try to sell pictures? And that's what I did, and that's how I was able to finish my studies. I did my PhD at the Sorbonne on a subject that touches photography. I did a thesis on the history of photography in France.
Because no one had thought of it before you.
Well, a lot of histories had been written on photography, but mine was a sociological analysis, an analysis of society, about the rising bourgeoisie that needed to have portraits, and that replaced the ancestors' gallery of the nobility by cheap photography. In other words, photography democratized art. Now, some photographers have no idea of sociology, and they're very great photographers because they have the eye. One thing is very important for a specialist, a professional. It's to make photos that are symbolic, that really give the quintessence of an idea or an event or a personality. And you don't need to be a sociologist to have this quality, because I think that the camera in the hand of a photographer is a bit like a translator. A translator must know how to translate well and put himself or herself in the skin of the person who wrote the book. And at the same time, I believe, one day Elsa Triolet told me that in order to be a good translator, it's necessary to be a writer oneself. And for a photographer, I always thought the idea to speak about photography as a great art. For me, photography is an artistic medium, if you will. I'm more modest, but there are big differences between professionals and amateurs, and indeed, some photographers are known all over the world because they have a larger-than-life personality, which is reflected in their photography.
Despite her naturalization thanks to a fake wedding, the artist had to flee occupied France. She moved to Buenos Aires and traveled around the whole of Latin America. In 1937, she began calling herself a reporter. In 1938, she was one of the first to use color photography. Freund's signature was her unlimited curiosity for people of all different backgrounds, for contrasts between people and contexts.
It was the war that forced me to become a reporter. In 1940, I had to leave, and I was invited by Victoria Ocampo, the director of the literary magazine Sur. When I arrived in Argentina, I didn't want to photograph Argentine society at all, but I wanted to get to know the country, because I thought one thing that can perhaps bring people together is to show them what happens in other countries. So I went to Patagonia and to Tierra del Fuego, and I crossed all of South America. And I began to work on big report on cover stories for American, French, Argentinian, or English newspapers for the world press. In 1947, I joined the Magnum Photo Group, which had been founded by Robert Capa, the famous photographer of all wars. And it was for Magnum especially that I covered South America. I was invited to give lectures in Mexico for 3 weeks, and I stayed 2 years. I believe in order to know a country, you really have to live there a long time. And then I've been interested in art all my life. I made a book on pre-Columbian art before Cortés, and also everywhere I would photograph the writers, poets, and the artists that I happened to meet and spend time with. So I continued to take photos of writers and artists while working and earning a living as a reporter. I never made my livelihood as a portrait artist because I didn't want to take portraits that I would be forced to retouch. Now, that doesn't say I'm going to photograph people in a bad way. I always try to bring out the best in a person. That's why I made my living as a reporter. And a good story, I can tell you how to build a good story if you're interested. You need a core photo, a central photo that is symbolic for the whole, a beginning and an end. And you have to tell the story in pictures. That's the simplest thing. Well, telling a story in pictures. And in general, quite often the reports are accompanied by words. And it's a fact that one can sometimes turn the meaning of the photos completely upside down, completely around with the captions. In my book, I mentioned several examples. It happened to me when I started, when I did a report on the Paris Stock Exchange. I had sent this report with the extremely modest title, Snapshot at the Paris Stock Exchange. And a few days later, I received a clipping from a Belgian newspaper that read, Paris Stock Exchange up, fortunes are being made, and so on. I was so surprised. I was almost suffocated when sometime later I saw in a German newspaper, panic at the Paris Stock Exchange, prices collapse, people lose millions and are ruined. And indeed, my photos could perfectly illustrate those two contradictory captions. Now, I must confess, I'm one of the photographers who write their papers themselves. I rarely work with a writer. It depends. I may be commissioned to do a story where both a journalist and a photographer are sent out, but almost always I do the story and the photos together.
Before she left Paris for Latin America, she became friends with the legendary bookseller Adrienne Monnier, Rue de l'Odéon. Through her, she met French and foreign writers who made Paris the cultural center that it was between the two world wars. She took over 180 portraits of writers and artists, often in color, that have become a unique testament to the thinking of the 20th century. She photographed James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Colette, Cocteau, Marcel Duchamp. In 1981, she did the official portrait for François Mitterrand's presidency. He posed for her in the library at the Élysée Palace. He kept this portrait for the 7 years that he was president. She mentions, for example, the portrait of André Malraux, his hair blowing in the wind that became so emblematic. In her portraits, she wants to reveal man to man, be a universal language accessible to all.
What's very difficult is to concentrate in a single image a whole personality. That's the problem of the portrait artist.
This is what you captured in particular with André Malraux when you photographed him with his wick in the wind, wearing his raincoat.
Yes. Malraux was the first writer who commissioned a portrait from me. It was a year after the publication of Man's Fate, and he needed photos. I still remember that day when Malraux came. I lived in the 15th district of Paris. I had a studio under the roofs, and on the terrace I photographed Malraux. Because at that time I loved taking pictures in the open air. And what was very interesting, because while making my photos I have conversations with the writers or the characters that I photograph with a very simple purpose. I try to divert them from the fact that I photographed them. Because, you know, everybody is afraid really to be photographed and asks himself unceasingly, what do I look like at this moment? They take a pose, and the art of the professional photographer, if you like, is to distract the person you're photographing from the fact that you're making a photo of them. So the best way to do that is to talk about your own work or something that interests them. I remember Malraux, at that time he was 35 years old. He talked a lot about the role of photography in art, everything that he published later in The Psychology of Art. Malraux said that photography can be a craft if anyone can do it, even with a very good technique, but if it is imitable. And a work of art is something that is not imitable, that's unique. Now, I don't claim that photography is a pure art. I believe rather that the role of the photographer is to be a good translator. But it can happen that over the head, if you will, of the photographer and his or her camera, a photo is created that really becomes iconic, exceptional.
In the programme The Great Reporters, broadcast in 1971 on France Inter and produced by Hélène Tournaire, it is amusing to hear her remark on the way artists are more at ease at posing than writers are. There are thousands of stories to tell about each one of these portraits, and she does it very well.
I believe that every man has some idea about his own image, so when he sees his photograph, he doesn't recognize himself. The psychological reason, I believe, is based on the following. When you look at yourself in a mirror, you don't only see your image, you also see your psyche, your psychological personality. And you're always very kind to yourself. That's why when you see the external image of yourself, you don't recognize yourself because you think you're better. I've had that experience with everyone, and particularly with writers and artists. Well, there is a difference between writers and artists. Painters like Matisse or Bonnard or Giacometti or others that I have photographed, they're not afraid of the camera. I had a great experience with Marcel Duchamp. He told me, you see, we artists, we know how to pose. We're not afraid of the camera, but a writer is afraid. He's scared, I think, mostly because he doesn't have a personal relationship with the public.
Isn't there a Proustian side to this? Aren't these men of letters more used to introspection than to the outside world?
Yes, that's quite true. I think that's one of the main reasons. Because a writer also reads through the lines of a face. And that's the task of a good photographer, too, to read through the lines of a face, to see what's underneath, under that facade. And also it's a fact that everyone wears his face as a mask in front of himself. Society, our whole life, forces men to forge a face. We're not allowed to express or show emotions. We try to hide them, and a writer is much more sensitive to these things.
In 1991, following the publication of her book Gisèle Freund, Portrait Entretien, Gisèle Freund Portrait Interviews with Raoul Dajami, and the show Gisèle Freund Itinéraire, Gisèle Freund Itineraries at the Pompidou Center, she was invited on the France Culture programme Du jour au lendemain, from one day to the next. She is 83 and is now, at last, a famous photographer. And yet, when Alain Weinstein tries to get her to talk about photography, she only wants to talk about writing, about the words she has always loved, about her lesser-known texts on photography that distinguish her from other famous photographers, texts which she wrote for free. She is clever and mischievous, and has at last found, towards the end of her life, a way of being paid as an author. Let's now conclude and discover her trick.
I still take pictures of my friends from time to time, but I prefer writing, because I'm not as strong as I used to be when I was young. That's why I have a camera that weighs nothing, 200 grams, and it's fully automatic. I think it's great to have this camera. You don't have to worry. Is the light enough for the color and so on? I'm very happy with it. And I have less interest in photography now than I did when I started taking pictures 60 years ago.
But after 60 years of photography, it must be hard to stop. Don't we sometimes dream at night, for example, that you are making this or that photograph?
No, not at all. I've always written as well. I never claimed to be a writer. I think I was or I am a journalist.
But it's still paradoxical to hear you say, I prefer to write, because that means you have more confidence in words than in pictures?
Well, it's easier to take pictures than to write when you don't have a language. I can speak 4 languages, but none of them perfectly well. And I've lived all my life surrounded by people who wrote very well. They would write 1 sentence a day. I think of Gide, for example, or other people I knew in my youth, like the surrealists, because the written word has always attracted me.
Coordinated by Mathilde Croix with the Aware team, directed by Élodie Royer, music by Juliano Gilles, credits and sound editing Basile Beaucaire, research advisors Catherine Gonard and Véronique Jolivet, French voice Camille Morino, English voice Eleonore Bess, Translation of the artist's voice, FD. If you enjoyed this podcast, rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.